All right, it's 6 o'clock, so we'll start the 2020/2021 KIDA KNC BP Edge workshop. Yay! So I'd first like to thank Jan so much for helping out and giving us a BP judging lecture. Jan, by the way, you're co-host, so once you're ready, you're available to share screen share and everything, I believe.
All right.
So I'll just go over the itinerary for today and just like to just introduce everybody who made this possible. So first of all, we wanted to host this Edge workshop for several reasons. First, we wanted to help people who are perhaps beginning adjudicators to learn the basics and learn not only the basics, but how to apply those principles to real life judging, real life debates. Also, for the sake of transparency, we wanted to share the CAP's intentions and their reasoning behind the judge test, as well as sharing and fielding any questions about the adjudication workbook or the tournament policies that are being implemented. So the schedule for today is we'll have an hour lecture by our dear Jan. And after that, we'll go through and review the first and second judge test. I know that many of you or some of you may have not taken the judge test, but don't worry, we have the questions there. And for the debate portion of it, we'll summarize portions of the debate and go through key points to show certain types of reasoning or justifications that we were looking for in the debate. Uh, and to be a little bit candid, it might take a little bit longer than 30 minutes as scheduled, but after that, we're open to Q&As as scheduled, and we will go through some of the questionnaires, questions that came in through our general workshop questionnaire and field questions from you guys as well. So let me just introduce Jan. He really doesn't need no introduction. But to give you a glimpse of his CV, he is a multiple time champion in CUDS Open, in KIDA Open, SNUDA IV Open, ICUT, and also was a chief adjudicator for KIDA Open as well. And once you hear him talk about judging and how to analyze clashes and whatnot, I'm sure that you know that Jan is more than qualified and a great adjudicator. So I will leave it to Jan now to take over.
All right. Okay. Let me just screen share first my material. Okay, this one. I see G smiling. Okay. So on the screen are the things that I'm going to cover, from note taking to understanding a team case, into analyzing arguments, as well as appreciating and critiquing it, as well as scoring, down to how you should behave in panel adjudication, and in terms of how you should provide your oral adjudication and do case comparison. Some basic things that I just want to flag that I'm not going to cover though, because I'd like to assume that everyone knows this already, would be one, in terms of the debate format. I'd like to believe that you guys have at least seen or adjudicated a BP debate format. I'm not going to go through speaker roles, but I'll be examining some of the gray areas in terms of speaker roles that we often have a lot of questions in terms of BP debating. And then lastly, I don't think I'd like to discuss this, but I don't think we'll have enough time to talk about grounds for challenging a motion, and as a judge, the things that you need to do. But just in case that we can have enough time, then probably I'll be able to touch on that. But yeah, but these are the things that I prepared for everyone. Before I start though, feel free to leave a message on the chat box if you have any questions, or perhaps just verbally interrupt me. I think that would be easier because I can't see the chat box right now. Okay, so let's begin. Let's start with oh, why is not moving? Start with note taking. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is in terms of the main goal in terms of note taking. Okay, so our goal here is for you as a judge to have materials that you can use to remind yourself in terms of what happened in the debate. Okay, so this becomes useful in terms of making decisions, and second, giving personal comments. Okay, so that's supposed to be your main goal. So you write things in order to understand the big picture of the team case of each, individual teams. Obviously, because there would be four, and then obviously we also need to get into the details in terms of jotting down the arguments, rebuttals, and other materials. Okay, so how do you do this? So you basically just flow. You need to be able to identify all of the materials that they mentioned. The way I do it, I'm not sure if this is a conventional thing to do, but my style in terms of note taking is that I prepare 4 papers in total to do this. So what I do is that I prepare one piece of paper per team. I know it's wasteful, but you can use scratch paper, you can use your laptop, use an Excel box. Okay, the goal here is that I need to be able to quickly capture the contribution of all the teams, right? So if I simply just flow it in terms of speaker by speaker, then I'll have difficulty in terms of putting together what were the arguments, and in general what was the case of each team. So for me to quickly do this, what I normally do is that I have one paper for opening government, one paper for opening opposition, another paper for closing gov, and another paper for closing opposition. So in that way, I can quickly see, all the arguments of each team, and I can quickly remember the case. So I don't know. I think if you're starting to adjudicate, I think the initial or the most crucial thing that you need to capture is the materials of the opponent. I know the downside here is that sometimes you might have difficulty in terms of tracking rebuttals, but I think the moment that you get the materials that they've said, then you can just mentally remember, oh, and the moment that you get to see, the rebuttals on your note, you can mentally remember what were they trying to respond to. So I don't know, perhaps you can do that. So that's the first thing. Okay, so the first goal is for you to be able to remember and identify the case of each team. The second goal in terms of note taking is that you need to be able to provide personal feedback to debaters. They love to ask personal feedback at the end of the day. So what I normally do is that apart from simply flowing, I also comment on my notes, okay? Things that I like and things that I think they need to improve, because these are the things that I'll be able to discuss during the personal oral adjudication, right? So it makes your life easy in terms of OA. So the way I do it is that I would use different colored pen. So one pen for the things that I said, and another pen or another colored pen for the things that I'd like to say about their case. So sometimes I would say that, oh, I think this point must be further elaborated. And also, I use a different pen so I can label the things that they've said. And these are the things that I want to discuss next. Okay. I think you need to be able to have a good understanding of what the team case is. But in terms of note taking, I think this is, the basic things and my style in terms of quickly understanding the case. And for me to be able to have materials both for making my decision and second, in terms of providing oral feedback. Okay. But more importantly, in terms of understanding the team case, because obviously you're not supposed to just adjudicate arguments, because if that's how you see BP debating, you will have a hard time coming up with a decision. So it's important for you to understand the team case. Okay, so the team case is basically the stance or position that each team will take so that they can win the debate. And I think a sophisticated or a comprehensive team case normally it would compose 5 important aspects. So one in terms of the context, second in terms of the principle, and then third practical arguments. Then you have the significance and comparative. Okay, so these are the things that normally in my notes I would label and try to find in their speech. And that if they say something that, oh, I think this is a principal argument that they try to forward. Oh, I think they're contextualizing their team case now. Okay. Now, when we talk about context, basically these are your factual foundations that debaters will use to nuance their case. Often these are observations about the status quo. Okay. So for example, in a motion that says ban party switching in politics, affirmative side would say democratic elections has turned away from party ideological politics to popular politics. Or opposition could also say that most countries do have multi-party system nowadays, and often these parties do not have clear ideological differences. Now, these contexts or foundations are statements that allows the debaters to navigate the debate so that they can ground their case in reality. Okay. Now, once they successfully do this, it gives them a strong command of what should be the direction of the debate. Okay. And hence, it would be easier for them to make their argument sound important. Okay. So normally, good debaters, like advanced and like excellent debaters, will spend a lot of time in terms of contextualizing it, because contextualizing their case, because it's important for them to be able to ground the debate so that they would say that this is like what we're supposed to discuss, because the status quo is like this right now. Okay, so in understanding the team case, you as an adjudicator must also understand, were they able to provide a good contextualization? Okay, or to begin with, was there any contextualization? Because often the problem of debating, especially when it comes to like neophyte or beginner debaters, is that they would simply debate on a vacuum. So meaning they wouldn't really discuss the status quo or the present situation. They're just simply going to give you some principal arguments and practical arguments. And sometimes it's quite difficult for you to adjudicate that if they did not tell us, like, so why are we discussing this? What's happening right now anyway? And why this motion is actually being debated. Okay, so that's context. Second one is in terms of principle. I think everyone should know this. These are your big philosophical ideas that everyone agrees on. One thing that you need to note is that principal arguments must be explained, okay? Even if it's freedom of choice or whatnot, but more importantly, like complex principles like hyperbolic discounting or precautionary principle, these things must be at least theoretically discussed by the debaters. Okay, like what do they mean by this? Otherwise, it would fall short as an assertion and not really as an argument. Okay, but one thing that you should just remember is that, as a team case, you should have a context and principle. And the third would be in terms of practical arguments, okay, or pragmatic impacts, your harms and benefits, effects to different stakeholders. One thing that we need to remember in terms of looking at practical arguments is that debaters must be able to mechanize this. What do we mean by mechanizing a practical argument? By this, we mean they must be able to explain to us the process of, so how did that specific harm happen in your discussion? Okay, they can't simply just say it harms the poor or it would hurt the economy. So they need to be able to explain the process of how do we end up to that point. Okay, that is supposed to be the responsibility of the debater, especially when you're adjudicating a practical argument. Okay, if the contribution has logical leap, or the argument didn't take off and remain as so if didn't take off, then obviously it should remain as an assertion. Okay, so just make sure that you do understand the differences of these three things. Normally, these are the basic things that we're supposed to expect from a college debater. If we get to further push, team cases, or in terms of understanding team cases, debaters should be able to discuss to us the significance of the case as well, especially in BP debating when there are four teams. Okay, so when we talk about significance of the case, this is the part where debaters will try to weigh, or if you've heard this term from your seniors, they should be able to meta debate both their arguments and their case. When we talk about weighing or meta debating or discussing the significance of the case, this is when debaters shows the order of importance of ideas in the debate. So they will tell us how to debate the debate, right? And they would locate their argument in a way that they get to conclude that because this is supposed to be the direction of the debate, then my argument takes the most important, portion in terms of this discussion, right? Like they would say that assuming all ideas are correct, they will be able to identify the priority of what idea should be discussed, and they're going to position their case and arguments in that way. Okay, and that's supposed to be how significance should be done in terms of being a component of team case. Okay, they would try to sell the argument that given all other arguments that all teams in this debate would discuss, ours is the most important, and then they'll explain that. Okay, and that's basically what we call the big picture debating or meta debating or simply significance. The last part that often we don't do, but hopefully some debaters will, this KNC, is in terms of providing comparative. And I think this would be a nice area that you guys can say, so even when it comes to like, like the most senior debater in KNC, because oftentimes they wouldn't have enough time or sometimes they would forget this, okay? A sophisticated team case must have a comparative, okay? So a comparative basically shows the alternative or opposing situation, okay? So normally, basic debating would only focus in terms of the battle of harms and principles. Like if you've judged YTN or any other middle school and elementary debate, they would only talk about like, oh, we have this basic mutual exclusivity in terms of arguments. Okay, advanced debating focuses on conceding the best and worst case scenarios. Okay, so it's not about who has the most harms or who has the most benefits. Sometimes they would concede different possibilities and different scenarios. Okay, and oftentimes what they're going to do is to show comparatives in terms of locating the extents and limits of the idea. So they would say that yes, that could actually happen, but in our case this could also happen. So meaning there are other things that we need to discuss then, right? Especially if best case and worst case scenario would cancel each other anyway. So oftentimes, the comparative can be used to mitigate arguments, and sometimes the moment that they mitigate argument, it's they use this as a tool so that they can successfully weigh the debate and say that given the fact that like clash A in terms of how whether it harms or benefits the poor becomes a wash, meaning no one really wins the discussion because we've extensively discussed this, then we move on to other things. Okay, and that's how normally sophisticated debates would happen. Okay, and sometimes or often we would like to expect comparatives to happen, especially when it comes to creating a sophisticated team case. Okay, so why am I saying this? I'm discussing the team case because this would become your toolkit in terms of evaluating the comprehensiveness of your material of the materials of the debaters. Okay, and then later we'll talk more about the quality of their materials. Okay, so in terms of comprehensiveness, you can use this in terms of adjudicating it, but more importantly in terms of understanding their case as well. This would help you label the things that they've said during their speeches, and oh, this person is discussing the principle, so let me label that as principle. Oh, the partner talked about the significance and practical, let me just write that down as well. And then you remember this lecture that, oh, but they kind of forgot to discuss why is this connected to reality or to the status quo. Then you can say like, oh, I think you guys should also further discuss the context, and if you want to further the debate, then maybe you should also discuss the comparative, right? So now you become the most comprehensive person in the debate, and you can provide a lot of personal feedback when it comes to comprehensiveness. Okay, and that's why unpacking team case is one of the crucial thing that you should do as a judge in order for you to have a good understanding of not just the case of the debate of the debaters, but in terms of how the debate went through. Okay, question so far? Okay, no one's talking.
Is it possible if you share the resources that you're screen sharing right now?
Okay, sure. I'll share this with the CAP at the end of the lecture. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions regarding the lecture? None. All right. Let's move on. Let's talk about arguments. Okay. Let's talk about quality versus quantity of arguments. Before that, just to quickly make sure that everyone is on the same page, when we talk about arguments, obviously, this is one of the crucial materials, not the crucial material, but one of the crucial materials that will help debaters build their case. Okay, obviously, we call this constructive material. So the basic question that normally beginner judges would ask is that, like in appreciating quality versus quantity of arguments, how do we look at this? How should we comment onto this? Like, obviously, I think you would, like instinctively would say, like, obviously, like it's supposed to be quality over quantity, right? So I think that should be established right now. However, the next question that we're going to ask then is, how would you know that that's the most important argument, right? For us to say that quality, trumps quantity, then we need to be able to know which, argument is of quality, right? So normally, the initial answer to this is that the best team or the best debater will dictate in the debate that this is the most important argument, and they would justify it. And hence, a while ago, I talked about the significance in unpacking team case, right? However, there are scenarios that no one actually dictates, what's the most important argument in the debate. In situations like this, as a judge, what you need to do is you need to be able to examine the entire debate and look more into what's the most engaged clash points in the debate. Like what were the ideas that they kept talking about over and over again when they keep passing the ball back and forth. Okay. Because if that happens was to certain ideas, then obviously that becomes the central theme of the debate. Okay. So the quantity of the amount that they spent discussing an idea would actually turn that idea as one of the most important thing in the debate. Okay, so that's one thing that you could also look at. But sometimes the best debates that you can see is when debaters jockey, or they would somehow find ways to capture how the story or how the debate should be. And I think the moment that you see that kind of debating, then I think you are basically judging a high level of debate, because they would try to battle in terms of how this discussion should be discussed. Okay, so that's in terms of adjudicating quality versus quantity. Okay, so I think the point, just to clarify, adjudication arguments is not about a laundry list of harms and benefits. Okay, it should always be about the quality. Okay, now in terms of adjudicating, we also need to do two things. Okay, one, in terms of appreciating the idea, and second, in terms of critiquing the argument. Okay, and that's why it's important for us to locate the arguments in their own case. Okay, so apart from simply appreciating the quality of the arguments, you need to be able to look more into the big picture. Okay, so like what I said, the argument is only one of the crucial components of a team case, right? So the moment that they're going to discuss an argument, if you're going to appreciate or critique this, you need to locate that argument in their own case. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is to look more into the consistency in terms of, does the argument help their own case to take off, right? Or second, and more importantly, in terms of balance, okay, do they have all necessary materials for a complete case, right? So we've discussed 5 components of team case a while ago, and that's how you're going to look at arguments, okay, by appreciating and critiquing it using 2 principles of consistency and balance. All right. So yeah, so that's in terms of my thoughts in terms of quality versus quantity of arguments. Next, in terms of the battle of principle versus practical arguments. The most important conclusion here is that both are important, okay? Second conclusion that I want to make is that you need to be careful in terms of adjudicating this. Okay, so I wrote on the screen that to be a complete and robust case, or to have a complete and strong case, both are crucially co-equally important. Okay, so adjudicating the significance of one over the other depends on how the debaters meta the narrative and direction of the debate. Okay, now what do I mean by meta? So going back to just reiterating what we mean by weighing or meta. Okay, so again, meta or weighing means that debaters answering the question what the debate should be about. Okay, so basically talking about how to debate the debate. Okay, but for them to do that, they also need to justify it. Or basically, if I break this down into different components, normally they would tell us what should be the goal of the debate, what should be the burden of the other sides, and what should also be their own burden. Okay. Um, Argument. I'm sorry. So that's co-equal, okay, not co-equality. That was written last minute a while ago. Anyway, okay, so that's the first thing. Okay, so you would know whether the debate should prioritize, for example, just for example, there's a clash of principle versus practical, okay? You're not the one who would adjudicate this in terms of like, oh, I'm going to discuss, I think principle is the most important and over practical, okay? It's supposed to be the debaters, okay? Because on prima facie or on surface, both are equally important actually. Like a principal argument doesn't really make sense without practicalities. Or same thing, the practical argument is not really that important if they don't discuss the principal idea behind it. So it must go hand in hand. But just in case that, you know, these two things becomes a clash in the debate, then, you know, debaters must be able to meta it, okay, in terms of what should be the focus of the debate. Now, other material battles would be principle versus principle. The best way to adjudicate this, for example, they've exhausted all, you know, the possible explanations. You know, assuming, for example, that in a debate about abortion, both sides did well in terms of explaining right to live and right to choose, right? The way for you to adjudicate this is to look more into who contextualized the debate better, okay? Because in that way, you would know that, oh, they actually tend to somehow try to understand the present situation, and hence certain principle becomes more important over the other, or more on in terms of the impact or the result or practical arguments, okay? So those are your two um, kits or tools for you to be able to address principle versus principle battle. Or when it comes to practical versus practical, sometimes the quickest way for you to adjudicate this is to look into who mechanized it better. Okay. Or same thing when it comes to looking more into contextualization of the argument and selling the argument or metaing the argument, or, you know, like discuss or weighing the argument in terms of significance. Okay. Again, the point here is that the components of a team case will be your toolkit in resolving these material battles. Okay? So that's in terms of looking into principle versus practical arguments, or principle versus principle, or practical versus practical. Sometimes there could also be context versus context, okay? And I think that's one of the most sophisticated and fun type of debate that could actually happen. They will contest what's really happening in the status quo. And I think if you just take a step back outside the debate, one, I think that should be a fun, you know, debate to adjudicate slash difficult, because now you would look more into the quality of all the components of a team case. Okay, so yeah. Next. Why is it not moving? Okay, on false matter. Is it false matter? Okay, false matter. Where's the false matter? Yeah. So a false matter happens when debaters intentionally or unintentionally provide a dubious or fabricated information. Okay, meaning either they intended or unintendedly lied in the debate. Okay, and I think this is one of the most annoying thing that could happen. Obviously, this should lessen the credibility of the speaker or team. You need to be able to reflect this on speaker score as a judge, because later we'll talk about as a reasonable average person. But having said that, this does not mean that just because a team lied, they would automatically lose. Okay, you're not supposed to immediately dismiss it. Okay, because sometimes you can give them the benefit of the doubt that, oh, maybe they unintentionally, you know, misunderstood reality. Okay, so don't immediately dismiss them. So the question is, what should you do then? Right? Like in cases that you would feel that, you know, I think the debater is lying. So what should you do? So the first thing that you should do is to check how the other teams respond to it, okay? And adjudicate normally. All right? So normally, if they're going against a strong and well-read team, they can point out this, you know, fabricated matter or false matter, okay? And then it's resolved, okay? But sometimes debaters don't know stuff as well, and sometimes the lie would simply just, you know, would be allowed to just play out in the debate. Okay, so the next thing that you can do is to check how the lie plays out, okay, in their own case. Okay, sometimes it wouldn't make sense. Sometimes it would contradict their stance, or sometimes it's not actually that useful or helpful anyway. You know, sometimes the materials may be false, but still the logic can still stand. Okay, so what you need to do is you adjudicate the logic. Okay, because often, you know, like the AP or like BP debating, they only have 15 minutes. So BP debating is normally a debate of logic battle. You know, they battle on logic rather than factual battle anyway. Okay, so you let them go, let them slide, just look at the logic that they're trying to bring into their arguments. Okay, but obviously debate is supposed to be about persuasive activity, right? So even if you feel that they're winning despite the fact that they're providing a lie, then simply just, you know, like lessen the score because they're obviously lying. You knew they're, especially if they knew they're lying, they can still win, but reflect it in terms of the speaker scores. If the other debaters did not respond to the glaring lie in their opponent's team case, then probably they should also get a lesser score for not really reading about the topic. But again, okay, you're not supposed to immediately dismiss or give a loss to a team that either intentionally or unintentionally lied in the debate. Okay, and that's how we're supposed to treat false matter when we're adjudicating. Okay, so just be cautious, and you know you can actually mention that to them in the oral personal feedback. Okay, so when they ask for personal feedback, not even in your official OA, okay, just mention it at the very end that, oh, I think this was a false matter. I'm not sure if you intended or not intended, but you know, this is how it played out in the debate. Okay, so that's in terms of adjudicating false matter. Okay, now let's move on in terms of negative case. So, so a negative case, so this happens when you feel that a team or debater tends to simply negate all materials of their immediate opponent. Okay. Now, obviously, teams must have a case, a stance, or a goal that they want to prove, right? In terms of negative case, so a negative case is actually acceptable as long as it contains comparatives. Okay, so often it's just an issue of framing and angling. Okay, so don't simply just tell debaters that, oh, I don't think you have arguments. I think you simply just rebutted. Okay, so rebuttals, if they are good and the most strongest, if that's the strongest rebuttal, obviously it will contain constructive materials. Okay, you can't simply fully rebut an argument without providing a comparative. Okay, so that's why I wrote on the screen that if that happens, obviously it's a matter of style and structure. So it's just a matter of framing and angling. So good negative cases will always have constructive materials anyway. And those constructive materials, remember a while ago, is basically what we call arguments. It's just that in this situation, it was framed as rebuttals, right? Because they just want to respond, right? So that's still a good negative case if they provide you with some constructive comparatives or constructive materials. Great ones will highlight the counterfactuals and comparatives. Okay, sometimes teams would intentionally do this, but what they would do is that they would flag that this is our counterfactual in what they've said. And obviously, if that's a counterfactual, that's the opposing situation, right? That's the comparative, and basically that's a constructive material. So for them to successfully discuss a comparative or a counterfactual for their side, then they need to explain it. And the moment that they explain it, even though it was used as a rebuttal, it's actually a constructive material. Okay. The last one is in terms of excellent opposing case. Okay, so in situations like this, you know, like sophisticated and advanced debaters would actually reframe it. Okay, and they would position the comparative as the immediate or important case or idea in the debate. And this is when you will hear like rebranding or recharacterization of ideas in a speech. Normally, this happens when debaters tend to say that, oh, in my speech today, I'll have three things to discuss, you know, like A, B, C. Everything would be integrated. Okay. So what they're doing there is that they're trying to arrange the discussion of the debate and saying that this is supposed to be the momentum of the debate. I knew, or I know that some of them were able to discuss it, but I'll be discussing this comparatively. Okay. And yeah, so that's supposed to be an excellent way of discussing it. A lot of people tries to do it. Some fails to do it. Um, also, some yeah, successfully can also do it. All right. So just be careful in terms of treating negative cases. Okay. So don't dismiss it as well. If they have comparative, that's fine. Okay. So often, I think opposition teams are, faulted by judges that, oh, I think it was too negative. I don't think you have arguments. So try not to be that kind of adjudicator. Okay. Because again, like if it's a good negative case and they were able to spend like 14 minutes just rebutting, then obviously they had a constructive material. Okay. Next, let's talk about extension, expansion. Oh, I'm supposed to talk about knifing. Wait. So yeah. So let's talk about extension, expansion, and rehash. Okay. Wait. Oh, there. I think it would be better for us to talk about knifing first. Okay, before that slide, let's talk about knifing. Okay, I kind of rearranged everything and now it's all over the place. So knifing happens. Um, okay, before that, I think knifing is a common issue with closing teams. Okay, so this happens when they contradict their opening. Okay, so we call that knifing. So technically, closing loses when they knife their opening, when they tend to contradict the stance of their opening. So that's in general. Okay, obviously, if your opening tells the correct context and they said that no, that's not the correct context, and they oppose those things so that they can have a different argument, that's knifing. Okay, and and technically they should lose. Okay, but if the opening's premise is founded on an absolute false matter or context, and everyone in the debate contested it as a false matter or context, then the closing can distance themselves from their opening. Okay, and they can clarify what is the correct context, and then they can take a different direction for their case. Okay, because obviously, if your opening has a false matter used as a context and case, then obviously it will also bring down the closing, right? And since close, even though you're on the same bench, you are still competing with each other. So you can actually correct and somehow just drop your opening and say everyone in the debate is actually correct. I think we also thought like the materials provided by the opening tends to be problematic. Okay, and we think these are what's happening right now. Okay, so you need to be very careful in terms of adjudicating situations when closing would either distance themselves or knife their opening. Okay, if they're simply just directly going to contradict their opening, especially when it comes to contextualization, characterization, without any justification, then obviously they should actually lose to their opening. Okay, but if there are some clarification, contestation in terms of what is supposed to be the correct contextualization, then we need to be lenient to closing teams and not really fault them for knifing when their opening committed a mistake of providing false matter. Okay, so just be careful in terms of threading, knifing, and distancing from the opening teams. Okay, now let's move on to closing teams in terms of extensions, expansion, and rehash. Okay, so these are three possible scenarios that closing teams can do, in a good way or a bad way, in the debate. Okay, so the first one is an extension. So an extension is an independent and totally new case that they can provide that is different from what their opening will provide. Okay, so that's a basically new discussion. I think the issue becomes blurry when it comes to expansion. Okay, an expansion is a further elaboration of a point mentioned or slightly discussed by the opening. Okay, so they kind of like discuss it, but did not really fully elaborate it. But they already said it. Okay, a rehash is a repetition of the case and arguments of the opening or previous speaker. Okay, so rehash could actually happen even for your DLO. If they didn't contribute and simply repeated their first speaker, that's also rehash. But the worst part that could happen is when closing teams rehash their opening. They simply just repeated the case of the opening. But I think the biggest question in the debate, especially for BP, is in terms of spotting a valid expansion from a rehash. Okay, so I wrote on the screen that debaters rehash when they copy and repeat an argument, okay? While an expansion is when they steal, okay? So I like to use Picasso's, I'm inspired in terms of Picasso's concept of what's a good art here. So I think it makes sense, okay? So expansion is when they steal a point by selecting elements or materials from the opening's case or argument, and then they would incorporate it into a unique mix of ideas, okay? And then concluding it away from the main point of the opening, okay? So you get what I'm saying here? So they get to steal it nicely and say, this is mine, or this is our case, away from the opening. So the point here is that the conclusion still must be different. Okay, so even though they would share some basic or similar, context or principle, as long as they can conclude a different significance, different comparative, or different impact, then that's an expansion. Okay, the point there is that at the end, the main point should be different, even though they share other things. Okay, sometimes, great expansions are often conceded by the debaters themselves. Okay, they would even say that we are going to expand from the ideas of our opening, and they would show you what are those ideas that they're going to take from their opening. And at the same time, they would also show you how they would diverge away from their opening's idea. Okay, so that's actually the great or an excellent expansion if they get to show you and walk you through in terms of, this is the part that we're sharing, like similar ideas to our opening, but this is the part, and these are the things that we are going to further explain that was not touched by the opening. Okay, and they would actually conclude those gaps as their material, and then if successfully done, then they've stole the idea of the opening. And obviously, if they successfully have done this and say that this is the most important idea in the debate, then they should get higher rankings against their opening. Or if they did not successfully conclude that it was totally different, then obviously they should lose to their opening. Okay, so that's quite crucial. Your role becomes very important in terms of adjudicating, was it an expansion or was it a rehash? Okay, so be careful. Okay, questions regarding this? Okay, no questions. Let's move on. Um, right, now let's talk about whipping. Okay. In terms of whipping, the basic issue that we would normally get is in terms of new matter versus new analysis. Okay, so a new matter or new ideas obviously contains new arguments or new conclusions. Okay, so that's basically just providing a different conclusion or argument for your team, and that's a no-no. Okay, a new analysis contains additional explanations and examples. Okay, the main point that I want to make here is that as much as possible, do not disregard the whip speakers. Okay, they're there for a reason. They're not supposed to parrot the case of their team. They're supposed to be able to further explain. Okay, they're not just rebuttal speakers. Okay, they need to be able to further explain things. So the next question that we need to ask now in terms of this discussion is, can rebuttals be considered as new argument? Okay, now my response to this one would be in twofold. One is in terms of, as long as the whip speaker gets to frame the idea as a rebuttal or an added layer of explanation to the existing material, and they get connected to their own case, the whip should never be penalized. Okay, because obviously we need to wait for the whip to respond also, right? That's one of their basic role. And sometimes, good rebuttals, like what we said a while ago when we talked about negative case, right, must be able to show comparatives, right? And one of the strongest skill that a whip speaker should be able to do in his or her whip speech is to do comparatives. Okay, so Just because the whip speaker was able to show a comparative, you're not supposed to fault them. Okay? But if the whip speaker went to a different direction of their initial case, okay, and concluded a different point, then that becomes a new matter. Okay? So this is now, so this depends now in terms of the ability of the debater to stylistically, navigate the whip speech in terms of connecting, materials as a rebuttal and connecting it to the main point of their case. Okay, if at the end the rebuttal somehow is, creating a different case, then obviously that's a new matter. Okay, so again, as a judge, this is a crucial point that you need to be careful in terms of adjudicating, is that a new material or is that a new analysis or simply a response to the material provided by their opponents. Okay, so be careful also in terms of looking at new matter or new analysis. Okay, next. um yeah, now let's talk about the average reasonable person. Okay, now this is the principle, or the expected principle that debaters would be asking you to follow as a rule. Okay, as a reasonable average person, I think your sonbes, like your senior, should be able to explain these things to you. But how do you practice this in KNC? Okay, so since KNC is going to be online, what you need to do is you need to enter the Zoom room. And as an average reasonable person, you need to be ready to be persuaded. Okay, don't be stubborn. Okay, be ready to be persuaded. Act like a spectator. Okay, so even though you're jotting notes, like distant yourself from the debate. Okay, like use the materials you gathered as a spectator in providing your OA. Okay, also but at the same time, you're not, even though I said that you're supposed to be ready to be persuaded, you also need to be mindful, of false matter. Okay, so I think your senior should have told you, like, as an average reasonable person, we consider you as a person who knows the headlines. So you read basic, facts that goes around in the present situation. So you are still in control of their speaker scores. Okay, so like what I said, you're not supposed to quickly make them lose the debate just because they lied. But at the same time, you can simply reflect this in terms of, like, the speech, even though you won, was not very persuasive because obviously you lied. Okay. So yeah, don't automatically punish them when it comes to false matter. Okay. Always examine the logic. But at the same time, distance yourself in terms of how these things are actually happening in the debate. Okay. I think I don't need to further elaborate this. I think you just need to be reminded in terms of you not entering the debate. Later, I'll talk about how you should appreciate case comparison anyway. We'll have more elaboration in terms of when to, do you have to connect ideas, or, do you have to take it as on face value? Next, in terms of scoring, all I want to say here is that, so I asked Jihi last night regarding the judge guidebook, and I look at the judge guidebook. The judge guidebook tells you the range of speaker scores. Okay, so please read your judge guidebook. And second point is that use the range. Okay, don't be stingy, but don't be overly, just giving away scores also. Okay, read all of these descriptions. Okay, my point here, I think the easiest way to do here is to work up and down from the average score. I think the average score would be from either, if it's 85, it's from 70. Wait, let me see. Maybe ask your CAP. Okay, they would dictate you, because normally it depends on the tournament. The range gets to be adjusted. My point here is that average score means that the debater were able to fulfill their role, okay, regardless of how convincing the speech was. Okay, so if they were able to deliver, a decent 6 to 7 minutes, they've done their rebuttals, arguments, even though it's not convincing, that's a average speech, okay, if they fulfilled their role. Okay, so don't just give 74 because you didn't like the speech. Okay, if they fulfilled it, that's average. Okay, and I think from there, you'll be able to work yourself up and down in terms of giving them speaker scores. Normally, what I do when it comes to scoring debaters, so that I won't have difficulty in doing this, is that at the end of the debate, at the end of each speech, actually, I would give them scores immediately. And then sometimes at the end of the entire debate, I'll adjust it depending on how I felt the debate went. But at least I would have initial scores on my paper already in terms of how I thought individually the speech went. Okay. And then as a whole, in general, when I heard everyone, then I get to further compare, did I use the same metric when I gave the scores to everyone? And in terms of engagement, how does it play in terms of either adding or subtracting points on speaker scores? Okay, point is, just read your manual. It's supposed to guide you in terms of providing scores. Okay, but always understand the concept of average scores. Okay, so during your judge briefing during the tournament, so one thing to ask is what's the average score, okay? And always work on there. Now, in terms of panel adjudication, so some of you would be chair, some of you would be, panelist. Unlike AP debating or AP judging, BP format is a consensus type of judging. Okay, and there are three things I'd like to discuss regarding this. One is obviously, regardless whether you're the chair or you're a panel, you need to be able to provide a holistic view on how you saw the debate. Okay, so just tell them what you thought, how the debate went. But more importantly, it's important for us as judges to maintain intellectual honesty. Okay, what do I mean by this? We need to be honest with the things that we've got, the things that we were able to jot down on our notes, and the things that we did not get in the debate. Okay, so one, if you did not get it, then obviously you did not get it. Either it's the fault of the debaters, or maybe you spaced out. Okay, and that's fine. Especially if it's a panel adjudication, you can always ask the other panelist or the chair anyway. But more crucially, do not conclude the arguments for the team. Okay, if they did not connect it, they did not connect it. Okay, if they did not mechanize it, they did not mechanize it. Okay, so make sure that you are not, this is like what the debaters would expect from you. Do not enter the debate, because as an average reasonable person, you're supposed to adjudicate it based on how the debate happened. Okay, so don't conclude the arguments for the team. If they miss a logical explanation, and then you know that you attentively paid attention, then maybe that's on them. Okay, and maybe that's one thing that you could actually discuss during your personal feedback to them. Okay, if you're not sure with your rankings, that's also fine. Okay, sometimes in my case, even like I would normally say that I'm sure with my first and fourth, I'm not sure in terms of my second and third. Or sometimes I would say I'm sure of my first and I know my third and fourth, but I'm not quite sure. Or I want to have a discussion for first and second. Okay, you need to be honest in terms of what you felt and what you thought of the debate. Okay, so just tell your panel about what you actually thought and about the debate, and explain. Like for example, if you're not sure and you feel that, oh, I'm scared that my chair might give me a bad score, don't think that way. Okay, as long as you get to justify that it's difficult to adjudicate because of these things, because these are the things that I got. And who knows, your chair or the other panelists would also have the same problem anyway. Okay, so trust yourself and just be honest about the situation. Okay, and third one, like what I said, BP judging is a consensus judging anyway. You guys as a panel would actually try to discuss, and like this is like a dialectical way of discussion. You will ask each other so that you can locate what really happened in the debate. Okay, so panel discussion is not a battle of egos. Okay, so do not be stubborn just because you have your rankings, and that's what you thought of the debate, does not mean that you're not supposed to listen to your other judges as well. Okay, sometimes you might somehow have some like unintentional bias when you made your rankings, so just be open also for their ideas, right? But it does not mean that you just simply accommodate their ideas. If they say that, oh, this is what they thought, but then again, you thought of something different, then discuss. Okay? And then hopefully from your discussion, you'll be able to find a middle ground or a common ground to say that, oh, maybe we missed this part and maybe that's why I'm correct or you're correct. Okay, and that's fine. Okay, so like, yeah, so if you don't understand the point, then probably debaters did not explain it, or probably, either you were thinking of something else, because sometimes it's difficult to adjudicate a Zoom debate. Okay, so ask and listen to the members of the panel. Okay, and you'll be fine. Because at the end, it's more about how you explain what you've got anyway, and that's how your chairs are going to adjudicate or will going to provide you scores. Okay, so it's more about the explanation as well. So similar to debaters, like we give them good scores in terms of how well they explain the situation. Your chairs are going to do the same thing in terms of how well you explain how you thought the debate went. Okay, so either it was messy and you can explain well that it was messy because these were the things that happened, then your chair most likely is going to appreciate that as well. Okay, so again, intellectual honesty. Okay, all right, next. We're almost coming to the end, which is a nice, I think, timing. It's 6:56. So oral adjudication template. Okay, I'll focus more on number 5, but I think, or I suggest that this should be your outline in terms of providing oral adjudication. If you're the chair, follow this 5 simple step. Like first, do greetings and niceties. Like it's always nice to introduce yourself, greet everyone. And then second, just like any other speeches, oral adjudication is a speech, right? And just like any verbal communication, it's very fluid, and you don't want to confuse your listeners. So you also need to provide an outline in terms of what are the things that you're going to do in your oral adjudications. Normally, I would say like, oh, in my oral adjudication today, I'll be doing 3 things. Like 1, in terms of my general observation, 2nd, the rankings, and 3rd, justifying the rankings. Okay, so obviously those are the other things that I suggest that you would do, like general observation or comments that you can provide to the debaters that would apply to everyone. Okay, and then obviously you provide your rankings, and then lastly, when it comes to justification of the rankings. Okay, now what's a good OA and what's a bad OA? Okay, I promise I'll discuss to you how you should justify rankings in a bit. Okay, now I want to talk about the structure first, a bad versus good OA. So a bad oral adjudication is when the chair or chairs do not spend time when it comes to important comparison. Okay, your role is to compare the case, how they meta the debate, the arguments, and the intersections of all other materials. Okay, a bad OA focuses more in terms of describing the case or repeating the case versus analytically weighing the debate. Okay, so that's your role as an adjudicator. Okay, you do not just simply describe the case, you need to compare and analytically weigh these comparison. Okay, so meaning a good OA must show comparison. Okay, weigh the important matters in the debate. So the important matters in the debate are the case provided by different teams, the burden or the goals, the arguments, and the other intersections of materials when it comes to engagement. Okay, also a good oral adjudication would differentiate their explanation of win, loss, or the rankings against their constructive or personal feedback. Okay, we suggest normally that you separate this, like you do your oral adjudication separate from your personal feedback. But sometimes, especially if you're the CAP, you don't have enough time. Normally, some other people would actually incorporate it. But like what an excellent, like negative case is, an excellent oral adjudication that would combine personal feedback from the constructive would also point it out. Okay, that this is where I saw the debate. Okay, now this is me entering the debate now and providing you a personal feedback. But be careful in doing that, because sometimes, like when debaters lose a debate, sometimes their emotions would cloud their listening skills and they won't really understand you that, oh, you're providing a personal feedback now. They would actually just simply think, oh, she's entering the debate. Okay, so that's why sometimes for your own, good, if you are competing to get a good score from the debaters, separate your personal feedback from your constructive materials. Okay, but if you feel that you can do both, then you can also experiment. Okay, it's a competition, it's a game anyway. Like You can either learn from your own mistakes, and when you get to see, your scores on the tab as a judge, that, oh, maybe it didn't work, or maybe it worked. Okay, but my advice is that to differentiate it. Okay, so that it would be easier for your case. Last one, in terms of justifying your rankings, okay, when in terms of case comparisons, because obviously, like in BP debating, right, we need to rank first, second, third, and fourth. There are three crucial things that I think you need to do so that you can successfully, or you can quickly, justify your rankings, or at least, or more importantly, come up with your ranking. Okay, so the first one is you need to be able to locate the focus of the debate. Okay, so like judging a high level room of debating, each debaters would fight in terms of what should be the narrative of the debate. Okay, so you need to be able to look into how did the debate transpire. Okay, so at the end of everyone's discussion, you need to identify what are the crucial questions that must be answered in this debate. Okay, what are the goals that this debate want to achieve? Okay, and what were the burdens that each teams wanted to prove, or burdens that was thrown to them? Okay, and how did they handle it? Okay, so you need to be able to locate the focus of the debate first, because in that way, the moment that you get to do that, then you would know how to appreciate the materials. Okay, so like what I said, good debaters would be the one dictating this. If they don't, then obviously the most repeated discussion becomes the crucial clash points of the debates. So after locating the focus of the debate, you also need to locate the cases of all the teams in the debate. Okay, now that you've identified the crucial question, goals, and burden, now you need to locate the cases of each team. Whose case responded adequately to the main direction of the debate? Okay, and this is when you get to rank the teams of first, second, third, and fourth. Okay, so you need to be clear in terms of identifying their case. Okay, that's why note taking was a crucial starting point of this lecture. Okay, you need to be able to understand that this was their case, and this is how they were able to argue their case, and how they defended their case. That's why it took off. Okay, so you need to be able to identify their case so that you can rank their cases. Okay, so obviously when it comes to appreciating or ranking cases, you can look at BP debating like an advertising competition in terms of who sold their case convincingly or persuasively in the debate. Okay, obviously that's under the impression that the case was well established. Again, that's when you get to somehow rank the teams. And then lastly, you need to be able to discuss who did it best. Like, so you need to compare and justify now. How did the team manage to navigate the debate by prioritizing their case? Okay, so this is a question in terms of engagement and substantiation. Okay, so you need to be able to somehow look into how they substantiate their case, how did they engage with their opponents and defended their own case. And then lastly, you need to explain your rankings substantively and comparatively, also using the components of a sophisticated case that we've discussed a while ago. So the old trend is for you to simply compare either first to fourth, like first against the second, second against the third, third against the fourth, or fourth against the third, third against the second, and second against the first. The new trend right now is to compare one team against all teams. Um, it's exhausting, although it's fun to do. I think I would leave the style in terms of how you do it to you, okay? Because obviously, at the end anyway, regardless of what strategy that you use, if you do it correctly, you would actually cover everything anyway, okay? And yeah, I think that's how we're supposed to be able to look at case comparison, so that it would be easier for you to be able to come up with your rankings and defend your rankings as well. Okay. And I think this is where I end my lecture. I hope I was able to impart, couple of important, tricks and basic materials that we need to follow in terms of adjudication. Okay. So yeah, thank you so much. if you have questions, let me know. I'm open to have any, it would be nice to have any questions, question and answer portion. If not, yeah,
I do have a question.
sure. What's up?
So I kind of noticed that sometimes in some motions, it is easier to come up with an argument with like
I'm sorry. I think you were cut. Hello?
much easier to come up with an argument, like let's say for the government, how this imbalance when judging, like should I over credit ops argument if they came up with one very subjective assumption for me to make?
Can
I
you repeat that? I'm sorry. I didn't get you. Like, I'm not sure if it's my internet connection or yours.
okay, perhaps it's mine.
Okay. Okay. You're
Well,
okay now.
am I okay?
Yeah,
right now?
you're right now. Right now. Okay.
So should I go from the beginning?
Yeah. Yes, please.
Okay, so I noticed that sometimes some motions are like much easier to come up with an argument for, let's say, government side.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of see these kind of imbalance. Should
Mm-hmm.
I take into account this imbalance? Like, should I overcredit ops argument? Let's say if they came up with a good one when I thought that, okay, this side is much difficult. So is there like such thing as an easier side, or is it just like a very subjective assumption for me to make?
I think there's two ways to respond to that. Like one, obviously, like bad motions are like that. But sometimes, there are motions that on face value, we thought Gov is easy, but if you analytically look at it, it's actually the same. Okay, so like for example, when it comes to the competition that I watched 2 weeks ago in terms of um, making vaccination mandatory for everyone for COVID. So if you initially hear it, it seems like it's easy to argue for Gov, right? But if you actually look at it, it's more, you know, it's what is this? It's more intuitive. It's easy to argue for op in terms of understanding concept of choice, the context of the vaccines. So responding to your question, I don't think um, we should be saying that we need to be lenient to one side just because we initially think the motion favors the other side. I'm sure that the CAP for this KNC will be debating the motions that they're going to provide anyway, making sure that there are adequate arguments for both sides. Okay, so don't worry about those things. I think at the end, like I believe in the capacity of CAP of this KNC that it's never going to be an issue. So as judges, we need to dismiss. Oftentimes, we need to avoid thinking about that. It's fun to do it, like especially if you're not really doing anything, you're just judging, and you thought that I think this is op bias, because sometimes our mentality, oftentimes that's rooted in terms of how we position ourselves regarding the issue as well. So as much as possible, like just divorce yourself in a situation, because in situations like that, you'll be even more impressed at, oh, there's actually a rich debate about this. So yeah. So don't worry about that. Like, just normally what I do is that I would always tell myself, I want to be surprised when it comes to adjudicating this debate. And oftentimes it does. So I don't think in situations like that, you should overcredit one side just because you, as a judge, initially thought that it's biased for the other side. But yeah, worst comes to worst scenario, like I've seen debates also that indeed it was a bad motion, it was a bad wording of the motion. And obviously, in situations like that, we just go with the flow of the debate, right? Good debaters would meta the debate anyway. If they fail to do it, then obviously the intuitive side would win, and we can't do anything about that. So as judges, we are not supposed to dictate in terms of who should we be lenient and not be lenient to, and
Right.
just adjudicate it based on how we saw it. Okay.
So in conclusion, it's like if I got that impression, it is very probable that I made kind of like a subjective assumption, right?
Yeah, that's the first part. And second part, even if you're correct, let's look at how the debate play out also.
Okay, all right.
Then when you adjudicate, like as an average reasonable person, you're supposed to dismiss, your understanding or expertise in terms of the topic. As an average reasonable person, us entering the debate or us, like facilitating the debate ends in terms of checking, is this factually correct or not? And even when it comes to that, a while ago I discussed, right? We're not supposed to make someone lose or win.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you very much.
All right.
Jan, I
I
also
have
have one
a question.
question.
Sure.
Okay, so this is difficulties that our juniors felt a lot in the session. So um basically I think when you're a rookie judge or if you're like not really experienced, do you feel comparatively easier to compare like OG versus OO because it's similar to AP, or like opening versus closing because it's much intuitive? But I think what they feel more difficult is comparing like OG versus CO, the houses that do not have direct engagement. And if the ranking ends up like OG's first and CO second, or vice versa, I think they have difficult delivering the oral adjudication because although they did not have direct engagement or like conversation between them, but still the ranking goes very direct manner. So is there any tip for you to give them like how to compare those houses that do not have a very strong like linkages?
Okay. Yeah, I think this is we call this an epistemological problem of debating in Korea. Because, like, normally in AP debating, this is even one of the problems that we have in Korea, especially when it comes to middle school, even for collegiate debating. We tend to have this type of ping pong debate. So we normally debate and judge debate based on how the arguments battle against each other, right? So that's basically how we normally judge AP. Even in AP, that's quite problematic because we don't look at the big picture. Oftentimes, we don't meta the debate in terms of discussing what are the important questions that must be answered, right? Because the moment that someone captures or able to answer what's the most important, discussion, then obviously it means that there are some materials that you don't need to respond anymore, right? But nonetheless, in Korea right now, and this is one of the things that I'm trying to do also in World School, is to be able to learn both big picture debating and ping pong or detail debating. So mostly, responding to your question a while ago, the juniors are judging the debate in a ping pong way, that in terms of argument versus argument. Okay, for you to be able to quickly judge and appreciate long diagonal or short diagonals in BP debating, we need to be able to start looking at teams, not just their arguments, but the case itself. Okay, so what is the case of the entire OG, right? So you need to be able to look at what's the main conclusion that they're trying to make, what is the direction, right? And then at the same time, when it comes to OO, what's their case, right? So you're not simply going to look at how the argument battled against each other. It's supposed to be more on how did the arguments help the case. And that's why, going back to note taking a while ago, I said that it's crucial for you to quickly understand the case so that you don't get caught up in terms of the battle of arguments. Instead, you will prioritize in terms of how did the arguments and other materials like the rebuttals help the case take off in the debate, right? Because the moment that you start looking at cases, you know, as opposed to simply just looking arguments, then it would be easier for you to appreciate closing teams, right? So, like for example, if opening government says that, oh, we're simply going to prioritize this, this discussion, and then obviously your opening team would directly engage on that, right? And then closing teams will discuss something else, and then some people would get lost that, oh, why are they discussing something else, right? So obviously, if they don't meta their discussion or if they won't sell it and discuss its significance, it's difficult for you to appreciate it, right? So I think that's one of the problems of the debaters as well. So at the end, like what I said, that if no one's discussing how to weigh the debate, then the judge obligation is to look more into whose material is mostly discussed, right? And that's supposed to be how you're going to do your rankings. And I think the moment that you start appreciating the case as opposed to the battle of arguments, then it's easier for you to look at what was the contribution of the closing teams. Okay, so I think that's the first thing that we need to do to make sure that we look at cases first, and not just looking into the battle of arguments. And perhaps it would be easier for new judges to be able to somehow make a call that I think that's a long diagonal, right? Because again, if you're a closing and then some of the discussion were exhausted in the opening anyway, the only way or the best way for them to win the debate is to spin the debate and discuss why there should be a new discussion and why the new discussion is actually more important. And then eventually, for them to successfully do that, they need to be able to show why the previous discussion becomes secondary to their point. So that's still part in terms of locating their case in the debate, right? So again, I think the simple answer is that let's try to identify our problem in terms of ping pong debating and start practicing appreciating cases and how arguments and rebuttals and other materials, even the contextualization, help the case. And if we can compare those cases, then I think the juniors will be able to become more confident in terms of deciding long, short diagonals. And they wouldn't be just caught up in terms of government side versus opposition side debating. Okay. Other question?
Can I have a question?
Sure.
Oh yeah. So I still do not understand what is the standard of being average reasonable person, because sometimes like I do encounter debate competitions where the educators expected us to talk about certain issues or bring certain facts or certain problems.
Okay. Okay. What's the question? What's
Like what is exactly the standard of like being average reasonable person?
as a
As
judge?
yeah, like sometimes I like there are also adjudicators who expected us to like bringing certain facts that the how to say, like they kind of giving standards on how the debater should talk about.
Okay. So one, like what I said, if you want to impress your debaters, you do those during personal feedback. Okay. But to be honest, the judge, as a judge, you do not have the obligation actually to provide a case for your debater. Okay. So as an average reasonable person, like what I said, the minimum criteria is that you are expected to know, the basic headlines. The reason there is that because at the end, you're supposed to be able to call out false matter, right? Or at least appreciate what is supposed to be the contextualization of the debate. But nonetheless, going back to our lecture, you're still not going to penalize them anyway, even though they lie. Okay. And then when it comes to you having factual understanding, I think that happens during training, because like when we go to our own individual sessions, obviously they would say that if this case is not strong, then what's the strong case, right? That's the role of the coach. That's not the role of a judge actually. But it becomes like an expectation nowadays in tournaments. So basically you just do that in personal feedback. Like you don't really need to provide those factual things, because the moment that you do that, debaters are going to fault you again for entering the debate. Okay. So I think other debaters asking for factual things does not mean them questioning your oral feedback. It's actually more on them asking personal feedback in terms of how they can improve their case, because you are a third person watching the debate, and perhaps they would think that maybe you'll have a better understanding in terms of how the debate could have gone better. But you can always say, no, I'm not quite sure also, but this is basically what just happened in the debate. And that's fine. Okay, because that's not your role to give them arguments anyway. Did I
Thank
answer your question?
Yes, but I have like another question. It's like when it comes to deciding, when it comes to like, um, for example, if the closing bench could explaining something in a better way, but
Mm.
the main point is just inherently the same, but they could provide more elaborations or more examples. Could that be counted as an extensions also?
So basically you said the conclusion is the same, but they have new examples. Is that it?
Yes, and more elaborations.
What do you
Yes.
mean by elaboration?
like better, how do you say it, like they could explain like in a comprehensive way compared to the opening bench.
Okay, I have so that's actually case to case because one, if it's only examples, they should lose. We're supposed to argue by logic, not by examples. But in terms of elaboration, if the point is the same with the opening, that's basically a rehash, right? Because we've heard the idea already, unless they would explain why the elaboration is the crucial part. Okay, why this would actually somehow becomes the central point of the discussion. But that means that the moment that they do that, they still need to be able to go away from the opening's main point. So I think this is one of the laziest type of reasoning of judges, like, oh, I think closing won because they substantiated better. I think we still need to be responsible in terms of what did they substantiate and why is that substantiation an important aspect for them to steal the material of the opening. Because if you would say that, oh, they were able to elaborate it better because they contextualize the debate and discuss what's really happening right now and why this context is the most important discussion right now in this motion, then they will win the debate. Okay? But for them to simply say, for a judge to simply say that, oh, they explain further, your debaters are going to hate you for that. So that's why I wanted to discuss the components of a team case, because that's how you're supposed to be able to angle things. That, yeah, fine. Opening discuss principle and pragmatics. And then, so yeah, obviously, right? And that's the most important, principle and pragmatics, but they never discuss contextualization. Then the closing can somehow, exploit contextualization and discuss why this is supposed to be the urgent thing that we need to discuss. And then they could actually, if they successfully do that, then they would win over their opening. And basically that's still an expansion. Okay. But if they're simply going to further explain freedom of choice under principle, like the principle had already been mentioned, even how nicely you would explain it, that's still an opening material. Okay. So again, for them to further elaborate things is for them to be able to exploit the other components of a team case. Okay. And that's why, as a judge, a while ago, I mentioned that you need to be able to label what are these materials that I'm receiving? Is this a principal argument? Is this contextualization? Are they weighing their case? Are they weighing the debate? And then, because I mean, to be honest, like a 40-minute speech won't be able to cover everything. And that's why there would always be something left for the opening. So yeah, so as a judge, you can only further elaborate that, oh, you can only make your closing win and say that, oh, they won even though it is an expansion because look at this, like they were the one who actually mechanized the impact and discussed the weighing. And then you could actually be able to somehow justify that, oh, even though you guys discussed the principle and practical discussion, it was your closing who contextualized it and sold why this is supposed to be the most crucial part of the discussion. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much, Jan, for your time. Everybody send your virtual claps to Jan through Zoom.
Good luck.
It was a great lecture, and I'm sure that some people may have more questions, but we also do have other material that we'd like to get to. So after we present our judge test results and explain some of the answers behind that, we have another Q&A session. So feel free to ask those questions then, and perhaps this portion can answer some of your questions as well. So we'd like to go through we had 2 judge tests so far, and we will be having a third, and that will be published tomorrow. So we'd like to provide some justifications from the CAP in regards to the first 2 judge tests. And while we know that some of you may have not seen the judge test for short answer questions, we have the questions here, and we'll explain them. And for the debate oral adjudication portion, for that, we'll explain the contents of the debate. But basically, and it will be the same for the third judge test as well, there will be parts in which we'll ask for you like a true or false, a multiple choice question or short answer question, in which there is an expected answer. And we expect you to know the rules of BP adjudication or the policies of this tournament. And for the latter portion, you'll be given a debate in which you evaluate the debate and present an audio file oral adjudication feedback that is preferably at max 10 minutes. And then we'll listen to that and grade that based upon 6 criteria. And if we don't have this in the slides right now, but if you'd like to ask about that later on, we'll be happy to share that. Anyways, well, then I'd like to call, Seokjin will kick off our explanation of the judge test.
Okay, hi, Andrew. Also, I send you the types of the ones I'm going to cover. I'm going to cover these questions, so you're going to skip to question number 3. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so sure, thanks. So just for clarification, if you have questions regarding like these questions, please feel free to open your mics up and tell me, because I might not be seeing the screen. So, or just leave a comment so I can cover these questions as well. So we're not gonna cover all the questions we have in the judge test, since we're also going to do that, but also do the time on our Facebook page later. But we also have some time constraints, and we also want to answer some questions you guys have in addition. So let's look at question number 3. So in a policy debate, opposition bench does not have the burden to provide a new counter policy. I think this is a very important question, considering that oftentimes debaters, adjudicators, or even debaters have some confusion about how to actually approach a policy debate. For example, a motion like, let's say, this house would ban prostitution. For example, motions like this house would put quotas for females in managerial positions. In these motions, there are different strategies in which debaters can take in order to cover, for example, opposition. Obviously, if you're a government bench, you need to describe why your policy is important, what kind of problem analysis. You have to provide a problem analysis. You have to provide why this policy is best suited to solve this problem analysis. So as an opposition, there's, I think, 3 ways in general for you to cover these problems. A, you can agree with the problem, but you can provide a better policy. So a counter policy might be helpful. For example, maybe you can explain why this other policy is more better in achieving this end. Second of all, what you can do is you can say that you can agree if the problem equally exists, but you think that having a policy like this will simply bring more harms than benefits than if you leave the status quo as it is. For example, I think a motion for this would be quotas for females in managerial positions. Obviously, as opposition, you don't really need to say that you'll have a new educational policy, because A, that would probably be something which government can take anyways. So you can just simply say the status quo is working fine. You're, for example, seeing oftentimes women making these positions by their own powers, and which can lead them to getting more respect than, for example, people were dragged into these positions, which would probably make males, for example, not really appreciate the effort that it takes to get to these positions. So you can obviously say that the status quo isn't perfect, but yet is working fine enough to accommodate these problems. So as a judge, it's very important that you try to catch what opposition suggests as a problem solvency for a certain if they agree that there is a problem. But third of all, you don't really have to say and agree that a problem exists. For example, if the motion is there's also ban prostitution, a team can obviously say that they would like to ban they agree that females are being hurt due to prostitution, but banning would do them more harm because of the mechanisms of, for example, like black markets, or for example, that would like shutting down like these businesses would probably be more harmful, stuff like that. But obviously, you can also you don't have to agree that this is a problem. You can actually say, well, this is something which can give you more agency as a woman, and therefore we don't agree that this is a problem that should be fixed. So there are multiple ways you can approach a problem. It's just very important that you don't try to overburden opposition because they didn't have like a counter policy. So let's move to question number 4. Thanks. So this is a specific scenario in which I think is helpful if you try to think of these specific debates and where you can apply what you just learned with Jan, right? This is covering, I think, what is average result. We're covering the principle of no automatic fourths. I think it's very important that oftentimes, especially when you're taking like AJ tests, oftentimes we'll ask the question if there are why should a team automatically place like last? And it's important that you need to compare a team's performance with other teams. Obviously, other teams can also make big mistakes that can cause the integrity of their logic or the case to unravel. And therefore, I think it's important that you don't look at teams in a vacuum. Also, an important thing is when it comes to having different models of with your opening, I think you need to be a bit careful of stating this team is knifing. The problem of knifing is that most of the times they would then deny the premise of a certain team, and therefore all the argumentations that bring after would lose value, considering we should discount this. But for example, a team can refine a model that was provided by opening side by saying how if they agree with the problem analysis and agree with the premise, it's just that you guys think that this specific model is best able to serve to fix the problems that, for example, Operation Bench talks about. I think it's a accommodation and a recalibration rather than simply knifing your opening. So in that case, it should be fine. You should probably discount some of the argumentations that would be that would derive from the original model, but you should not discredit every the other benefits that comes from recalibrating this model. So just be careful. Don't give automatic forks, but also try to see what this team is, the problems of this team compared to other teams and their performances. Because obviously they might have problems in regards to definitions. They might have their own case might for example, closing operations case in this debate could be really, really bad, and therefore they really have to place fourth. And maybe this team, even though they knifed significantly, could still place third. Okay, let's move to the question number 5. Okay, so define proposition fiat. So I think it's important for us to understand why we have fiat rules in the first place. It's because we don't want the debates to unfold around like these nitpicking things about, oh, this wouldn't even happen, so therefore we shouldn't talk about like whether or not the benefits of this policy, but rather whether this would pass parliament, whether we have enough resources, or etc. So a better debate would revolve around why we should or should not do something, rather about why it will pass or not. So and this does not mean that the policy would be perfect in its practice. This is also a question we asked through the second ASH test. And I think our fellow CAP members will cover this. But it's important that for any motion, when you're actualizing any policy, that it's okay for opposition to argue that these policies might have flaws considering the realistic scenario. You wouldn't be able to completely, for that, if you just also ban murder, obviously you wouldn't be implying that you have the capacity to prevent every murder from happening whatsoever, or unless you have like the minority report or whatever. So I think it's important that opposition can exploit these things, but also judges recognize this is not going against the fiat. But also opposition teams can argue, and there's an important trade-off when it comes to these policies. So even if a policy might be a bit difficult to enact, and you should assume this policy can be enacted, but you can do an opposition to say that the resources that is required for this policy can be better utilized in other aspects. Like any motion you can think of about policies, you can say this policy can be enacted, but yet the resources could be better utilized in, for example, when it comes to political resources, when it comes to monetary resources. So that would cover government fiat. If you have any questions about fiats, please ask now. Are you okay? Okay, let's now move to question number 8. Thank you. Question number 8. So opening government gives arguments that are obviously factually untrue and has several logical inconsistencies. However, no other team directly engages with OG. I think Jan already covered this to some extent, but I think I'll just explain it additionally to this. So in principle, judges should remain non-interventionist, but doesn't mean that judges should be infantile and they should understand every argumentation as is given. If you, as an average reasonable voter, think that certain argumentations are unsubstantiated to the extent that you cannot believe, even if you are willing to believe these argumentations, or can lead to other results. Or for example, if you know as an average reasonable voter, that is, if you're as an average reasonable voter, you just probably read the news, you have some general sense of what's happening in the real world. So like something that is simply fallacious, like I don't know, Vladimir Putin isn't the president of Russia, maybe some other communist figure is simply factually unwrong. So you can probably discount that while you're giving the validity of certain argumentations. This does not mean that teams have to explicitly engage and point this out. And you can do this, but only to a certain extent if you believe this is something which is covered under the average reasonable voter. Secondly, I think it's also important that debaters and adjudicators notice that rebuttals don't have to be necessarily directly engaging. What I mean by this is that teams can still innately cover argumentations or rebuttals by providing arguments, right? For example, if these argumentations don't really directly say, oh, I'm engaging to opening opposition government, but they can already have these argumentations that, in logically speaking, are in direct contrast or can destroy a certain case current from opening government, then you should still credit this. I think this more often happens when it comes to opening, for example, opening government and closing opposition analysis, considering there's like a long gap between the two. And closing opposition can obviously engage to closing government, but if the logical premise of opening government is tackled in the process of closing opposition, attacking closing government, you should also credit CO for destroying most of OG's case. So just be careful. And it's oftentimes better if debaters would explicitly say what they're doing, but just because they don't explicitly say it, you should still consider the logical argumentations and how it extends or impacts the dynamics of this debate. Yep. Let's move to the next question. Question number 10. Okay. So it's a long question. So I'll give you some time to read it, like a minute or two, since I'm sure debaters here might not have covered this question. Okay, so are you guys okay with going on? If you need more time, please chat, or if you're okay, let's just go on. Okay, so I think it's a tricky question, and just a disclaimer before moving on. I think it's important that even if we try to make these questions with an ASH test, that oftentimes these situational questions can still be situational. Which I mean by that is sometimes in debates, you really need to see the extent of contributions and the dynamics that happen between all four teams. Obviously, in the process of simplifying these questions, we would have to necessarily make certain conditions, but I think you should still something you should consider is that this is not an absolute formula in which you should follow, but rather the likely ranking. So just be careful when you're in a debate to not really differentiate between, for example, positive contributions and negative contributions. For example, giving arguments versus giving rebuttals. You should obviously weigh the positive impacts versus the negative impacts when it comes to teams. That being said, the likely answer that the CAP provided was first would go to closing government, second would go to open opposition, third going to opening government, lastly fourth going to closing opposition. Let's cover these one by one. So we gave in this info slide or question that there was a clear winner in the opening bench, right? Considering that opening opposition's case was a bit more logically and impactful and more logically consistent than OG, right? So it's important that you don't consider the contributions of another team when you're coming to a bilateral rankings between two teams. You should only compare what happened between opening house. And you shouldn't, for example, consider that, that CG was able to negate all the benefits coming from opening opposition. So what remains at the end of the debate should become weighed against opening government. That's what CG did. CG did to OO's case, not what OG did to OO's case. And that would be taking away credit from CG. So it's important that you look at the comparisons between what remains after the exchanges between opening house, right? So that would mean that that would mean OG would probably lose to OO given these conditions. I think the more trickier part is looking at CG versus OO. And we also like to refer to what Jan said during extensions. So extensions aren't simply providing new unique argumentations that have different premises or different conclusions. Extensions also can have the same conclusions, but can be meaningful exchanges in which you're able to provide more reasoning or mechanisms to believe, to make this case more believable. Because obviously, when it comes to a case, it should have impacts, but it also should have mechanisms to make us believe why that world is likely. Also, in what's important in extensions is that your contributions of engaging are equally important, because you wouldn't differentiate the positive contribution versus a negative contribution. That being said, then considering that closing government was able to build upon opening government, not upon the mechanisms and the believability, you shouldn't discredit them for simply overlapping the conclusions because they're providing additional analysis. They're also doing this debate is they're trying to OG goes under OO, CG rebuts actively against OO and therefore fulfills their end of the role fulfillment by trying to negate most of benefits coming from OO. That would mean that for this exchange, OO would first lose under the CG, considering that there were engagements that were effective, but also because also OG would lose to CG, considering CG was able to provide meaningful extensions that might be considered vertical, but also because opening opposition, the role fulfillment when it comes to engagements were better fulfilled during CG. Therefore, CG would place over OG. In this case, so again, notice that this wouldn't influence the exchange between opening house. But lastly, we put in the question that closing operation fails to engage the either gov bench, but also this means that closing opposition doesn't really have a new material. So therefore, when it comes to a bilateral comparison between opening and operation bench, CO should place under OO. That being said, then CO would probably place under OG, CG, and OO. OG would place under OO. CG would place over OG, but also CG would place over OO. That would mean that CG places first, OO places second, OG placing third, and CO placing fourth. If it's a bit tricky, so okay, and we'll probably release this later. So okay, we have a question from Brian. Okay, possible place. Okay, the question I got was, is it possible to place OO over CG since CG only mitigates most of OO's arguments? Doesn't it mean that part of OO still stands and that the part remaining on OO may beat the substantive additions of CG? Yes, I think this is the part where I said it becomes a bit more tricky. So yes, in a hypothetical sense, it's possible. So this is why I think the CP tried to provide that at CG, you're substantially reducing a lot of the impacts coming from OO, but also your extensions are quite meaningful because they provide additional analysis. So in terms of the positive materials which CG provides, then in addition to a negative, in addition to negating most of opening operations case, I think it's reasonable for us to assume that CG is winning. Obviously, but this does not mean this will always happen. For example, it can be a hypothetical case in which CG's new extension is unique, but yet isn't as impactful as what is remaining after like opening operations has been eviscerated. But like it would depend on the level of engagement. But at least in this question, I think what you're trying to say is that the engagements are substantial and therefore are most likely that this case is coming from OO are largely mitigated. So it's a bit of a tricky thing considering we don't have a real debate in which you can practice this. So, but yeah, I think this is a valid question. So please do consider that the remaining cases coming from OO can actually overweigh what comes from CG, depending on the debate at least. So yes, just try to be careful in these conditions. Are there any other questions? Oh, but please be careful that your just because a team engages to an other team does not mean their negative contributions should be placed lower than positive contributions, because that is, as Jan said, there's no real meaning between differentiating between engagements and building your own constructives, because to be honest, you can just simply say, oh, your engagements were part of constructing your own argumentation. So this should probably not say things like, but these were simply rebuttals, were not arguments, so therefore we thought opening opposition, for example, had more argumentations, and just give OO a win. Is that okay? Are there any other questions that you'd like to cover? Okay, let's now move. I'll pass on to Andrew now. Thank you.
All right, I'll try to keep it short because we're running a little bit behind schedule. So anyways, for the first judge test, we had a motion as written. This House would ban religious parties from participating in elections in newly democratized Arab states. And the consensus that the CAP came to was first going to CO, second to OO, so an opposition bench win, third to CG, and fourth to OG. However, there were differences among the CAP panel, and I like to say that whenever we provide these verdicts and publish them to you guys, we don't necessarily grade upon how close you are to our verdicts. We recognize that there could be differences of opinions, and equally how a chair doesn't take away points to a panel simply because they reach a different conclusion or verdict. We won't do that to your judge test as well. However, we do sometimes in some debates, it's highly likely that the more reasonable verdict is something that's closer to ours. So we think a lot of times it's probably unlikely that someone we gave fourth to is likely to place first. And therefore your OA may be graded differently because of how we value that type of reasoning, but it's not simply because you have a different verdict. So we just like to make that clear. And so to go over just some comparisons, I like to lay out the scenario for you. So, So one point of contention was between OG and CG. What happened was that OG's main contribution was talking about the necessity of the motion. So they spent a lot of time and put a lot of effort for their arguments about minority religion protection, and therefore there should be no religious parties, and how when you're trying to establish a democracy, a foundation of a democracy, how it's important to be rid of religious influences, and therefore there should be no religious parties. For CG, a lot of their contribution was through mechanization. So they would, mechanization meaning, they would explain how the motion would necessarily achieve these ends. And they focused on why religious parties would, while focusing on why they would deter democratic development, they also told me how the motion would help them develop democracies as well. In this case, as I think something similar came out during Jan's lecture, they essentially have the same conclusions. They're going for the same goals, but however, the portions that they decide to focus on and elaborate upon are quite different. OG explains the importance of those goals, while CG explains how those goals are achieved. So in evaluating this, you could use two different metrics, and these are by no means exhaustive. So first, CG provided more sophisticated analysis, breaking down how religious ideologies could penetrate specific democratic principles like accountability or check and balance. These types of were examples, and layered analysis was provided by CG, whereas OG was a bit more assertive and relied on more intuitive logic to justify the arguments. They would say things like, oh, because there are minority religions, they probably won't be able to get power with religious parties. And that seemed to be the extent of their analysis. It would have been greater appreciated if there was more nuance or more characterization behind those. And we think on those levels that CG provided better analysis. And therefore we credited CG higher than OG. But moreover, when we simply looking at giving full credit to those contributions and looking at them in the flow of the debate, it seemed more reasonable that CG provided the more impactful contributions, as you could probably reasonably expect from the motion. But also during the flow of the debate, the focus didn't become necessarily on whether there's a necessity for protecting minority religions or establishing a healthy democracy, but rather how that would happen. And the crux of the debate became centric around how. And the OG, while given the opportunity to respond to those points by OO, failed to do so, while as CG was more responsive to that central issue. And as a result, we thought in those two realms, we could reasonably say that CG's contributions outweighed OG, and therefore CG placed higher than OG. So this is just a little application of the theories that we talked about during Jan's lecture. So this is also something that's quite more difficult a lot of times when we have a diagonal. And because these teams don't directly clash with each other and don't have the opportunity to directly respond to each other, this makes this a little bit more difficult. So here's an example. As we talked about CG had provided the extensions that I had previously mentioned. However, OO also contributions were largely centric upon how religious protection would actually happen better underneath a world without this motion. And additionally, in addition to that, provided nuance on how this provides a platform for better, healthy democracy, as well as providing key rebuttals in terms of how it's impossible to separate religious ideas from individuals. And therefore, even if you have no religious parties, there's no true impact behind this because individual politicians will be influenced by religious ideas nonetheless. So CG's extension comparatively, therefore, had more limitations. Its mechanization of OG's conclusions were not exceptionally persuasive in that they were limited to the extent of, they were limited in the amount that they could prove. This was largely reflected after CG simply, through simple engagement, dismantled CG's mechanization and proved a lot of flaws and holes in this, which CG Whip was also unable to recover. On the other hand, OO provided several points of positive material, which I've stated, and these were mostly standing at the end of the debate, which reflects not only the impact of OO's contributions, but also reflects the failure of CG to fully perform its role and engage with OO's material, despite them having the largest opportunity to do so. And also, on another level, CG's contributions were also highly reflected in their contribution with Opening House, where after the dynamics of the Opening House exchange, most of the panel, all the panel clearly agreed that opening opposition and clearly won that exchange. We thought we could also see that O's engagement was something that highly contributed to the debate. And therefore, when we see CG having limited engagement and contribution in terms of engagement, O having a high amount of contribution, also when comparing the positive materials, because we had reasonable consensus that O's positive materials were more extensive and more elaborate and could and were better standing at the end of the debate. We thought that OO placed over CG. So this is how we evaluate that short diagonal, even though there wasn't necessarily direct engagement with each other. If you have any questions, you can ask them at the end with the Q&A. So keep your notes, I guess. So we'll move on to Hewan, and he'll go through some of the MCQs of the second judge test.
Okay. I think we can just skip through a couple of these, and considering that most people tended to get them right, so we can skip the first one. The second one, I think we can also skip. The third one I want to talk about. Okay, so the third one is was a bit of an issue for I think a few people. Basically, this is false. I think Jan also sort of mentioned this before, but if you believe the motion is biased, then that's number one. It might just be you, and therefore, and as the principle of non-interventionism, your own opinions about what the motion could be may not exactly be the right opinion. So you should try to do your best to keep your opinions out of the debate. And secondly, even if the motion actually is biased, I think it's not your responsibility to try to change the verdict when in one way or another in order to try to, like, I don't know, counterbalance the motion's bias. In that case, it's the CAP's responsibility, and you can let the debaters complain to us in that case all they want. The point here is that in the interest in the principle of non-interventionism, just because you believe that the motion is easier towards one side than the other, does not mean that you should give a side that had the harder side, so to speak, given that they both have similar persuasiveness arguments, the better hand in the comparative. Yeah. After that, we can also skip this one because I think everyone got this right. All right. Okay, so here we had also a bit of an issue. I do agree with some people who answered this question, most people who answered this question, that contradictions are a pretty big problem in everybody's cases, but again, I think this has been reiterated multiple times by multiple people before me. There's no such thing as an automatic fourth. You don't, like, just because you have a big contradiction in your case does not mean other teams also have big contradictions in their cases or other problems, or maybe even though you have a big contradiction, there's a different part of your case that wasn't contradicted by anything else, and therefore could stand on its own and maybe get you, I don't know, even a second or a first in the room, depending on how bad the rest of the teams were. The point is just because you have a significant contradiction in your case does not mean that it's negative, like against the entire rest of your case or the entire rest of your case when compared to other people. It's just like negates what has been contradicted, and there's still stuff left over that can still be compared against everybody else, is the point here. So no, there's no such thing as an OO, as an automatic fourth, and therefore OO, we don't know whether or not OO gets a fourth in this room because there just isn't enough information for us to tell like how OO did against all 3 other teams in this room. And then next question, please. Okay, this one, yeah, this one's just pretty quick. Again, in the principle of non-interventionism, as judges, we shouldn't try to assume that principal arguments matter more than practical arguments. It is a debater's tendency to kind of count practical arguments more just because their impacts are easier to visualize. Now, this doesn't mean that practical arguments inherently matter more. We should also still do our best to value principal arguments just as much as practical arguments, at the very least, the impacts that are given to us by the debaters. And yeah, so basically, no. All right, here I just want to clarify. I don't believe we discredit many people for answering the question wrong, at least those of you who took this judge test. But I do want to clarify, like, exactly if you end up being a chair, like if you read through this, it's basically clarify where exactly you disagree. So since BP is based off of bilateral comparatives, you want to clarify which bilateral comparatives you agree on and which ones you disagree on. So there's, I believe, 6 bilateral comparatives that exist in the debate. Try to see which ones are the most agreed upon. So maybe everybody thinks that, for example, here that that OG is above CG. In that case, you don't have to talk about that, right? But then you might see that like what 2 people agree that like CG is above O and one person disagrees on that. Then you can start seeing where exactly the disagreements are when it comes to the bilateral comparatives. And then once you start discussing these bilateral comparatives one by one, it actually makes going to the decision much easier because you can start dismantling all of these disagreements in a very simplified, like step-by-step manner. And then as you discuss these comparatives, hopefully you can reach a consensus on each comparative as time goes on. This tends to happen in almost every case in my experience, unless some people tend to be very, very stubborn. But and then if time runs out, then obviously you end up to a vote. Hopefully at that point you've already discussed enough comparatives and reached a consensus on enough comparatives that you're only voting on, say, 1 or 2 like comparatives or like 1 or 2 differences in the rankings. So we're voting, for example, like oh, we all agree it's an opening half win, but we're just voting between 3rd and 4th, or we're just voting between 1st or 2nd, or so on and so forth, right? And at that point you might vote. And also you should note that in a vote, panels count just as much as chairs, but trainees do not have a vote when it comes down to this kind of thing. So that's something that we should note when it comes down to this kind of point. Yeah. Next question, please. All right. Definition challenge. I think most people also got this right. Just a couple things to add. Yes, it comes up. Number one, it's only valid if the original definition was like seriously bad, like it was seriously unfair, so seriously like say untrue. Secondly, it can only come up in the LO. Any later than that, a definition challenge should be seen as invalid. The reason for that is because if it doesn't come up in the LO, then and it comes up in say like the DLO, then that means OG has effectively just spent their entire case on debating on a definition that nobody else may or may not debate on. So for that reason, definition challenges only come from the LO and not really from any other speaker. And secondly, even after a definition challenge has come up, we should acknowledge that we can't show to the debaters whether or not the definition challenge has been valid or has succeeded. So therefore, debaters should still make an attempt to engage on both definitions, which is something that you will see happen in rather unfortunate rooms where definition challenges seem to not be accepted by the government side as well. And so in this case, and in the end, the debate, when you evaluate the debate, you have to kind of take into account everything. You're like, did the definition challenge succeed? Okay, but what does that affect, right? And even if it did not succeed, how well the teams do to engage with the other team on the other team's definitions as well. So this kind of holistic evaluation is also required even in debates, unfortunate debates with a definition challenge. It's not as simple as if you want a definition challenge, then the other team's arguments are entirely valid and your arguments are entirely valid, and therefore you just automatically win. It needs to be a bit more nuanced than that. And so when evaluating the aftermath of a definition challenge, I think you're going to do your best. Going to have to do your best to try to evaluate everything everybody said, as opposed to just focusing on the definition challenge. Next question, please. All right. This one was a bit tricky for a lot of people. So there's actually 3 valid answers to this: A, C, and D. So in this question, I believe the options were A. Hold up, they're written here. Sorry. A was abortion's going to exist on the black market anyway, and the B was there's not enough political capital. C was something. Oh yeah, it was about it would attack women's bodily autonomy, and D was it would raise crime rates because it makes unwanted children, and then E was none of the above. the reason why it's A, C, and D is the following, right? So the reason why it's A is that like abortion is going to exist on the black market is that is still a valid argument is that even though proposition is assumed to have the legislative or political capital in order to pass whatever it's want to pass in the motion, it's not assumed to have the ability to completely enforce this to the amounts that it would want to. Obviously, we can assume that it's going to try to enforce this as much as it wants to, but we can't assume that this enforcement will be entirely successful. And this kind of characterization comes into play a lot when you're talking about, say, like developing countries or countries with like remarkably corrupt governments. Then a lot of the times there is an argument saying, oh, these governments are so corrupt that all of the money used to do whatever policy is going to be misused anyway. We shouldn't spend money on this or in this way. So this is arguments that frequently come up. So the point here is that prop fiat, which has been explained before, I think, by other people, only extends as far as the legislative power. It doesn't go as far as like how it can be enforced or like going all the way down to the ground. Like at that point, you don't like opposition has grounds to attack proposition now. And then B is we don't have enough political capital. I think this was a pretty straightforward, like that's a attack on proposition fiat, which is not valid. Like obviously proposition should need to have enough political capital in parliament to pass this motion. That's why we're debating this motion in the first place. If we didn't, then this motion would be meaningless. C, women's bodily autonomy. I think women, everybody got C, that, this would be an attack on women's bodily autonomy, and therefore, and that's a reasonable argument for opposition to make. So that was, I think everyone could see why this is a valid argument. And then D, unwanted children leads to higher crime rates. I think this one, I think a couple of people didn't choose this, but and just want to make clear is that just because an argument seems, how do I say, a little iffy or a little far-fetched doesn't necessarily mean that you should completely discount it, right? Like you can still if other teams didn't engage with that argument, then maybe you can still credit to that team that said, to that opposition team that said crime rates will rise, that, oh, okay, I can see that crime rates will rise a bit, right? And so like this is still a valid, reasonable argument for opposition to make, even though it might not be might not decide the debate in one way or another. But like this is also an option that I think people needed to choose. And then finally, the last question. This was a bit quick, right? So I think almost everybody got this one. It's basically just it's a test of like in a very, very, how do I say this, vague manner of how you can identify a vertical extension. So basically, if you read the question, you can notice the crux of it is that opening governments introduced a bunch of arguments, and then closing government came in, and then you basically expanded upon those arguments. So they made better mechanizations, right? They fleshed it out a lot more so that they could let the judge adjudicator see a lot better in their heads, like what the impact of those arguments were. In this case, even though opening government does and the question asks, does closing government rank above opening government, given that they haven't really been engaged to, or they haven't they both or nor doesn't nor have they really engaged with the others at bench, right? So sorry, there's a bit of a loophole there. Sorry, closing government, opposition did engage with closing government, but I'll get to that later. So in this case, since closing government did flesh out opening government's material to such an extent that we are able to visualize it from closing government's side much better than opening government side, we give it to closing government. We consider this a vertical extension in the sense that even though closing government didn't come up with entirely new material that seems to be, that is very easily distinguishable from what opening government saying, because it made opening government's arguments far more persuasive than opening government did against that means that their contribution to the debate was bigger, because without them, then opening government's arguments would be much, much weaker and would probably lose against, say, and might have lost against either opening opposition or closing opposition. But with them, opening government's arguments now can win against opening opposition or closing opposition, and we consider that a positive contribution, a vertical extension that means that closing government, in my word, the way I tend to phrase it is, took over opening government's arguments. They took them for themselves, and now these are closing government's arguments because they contributed more to these arguments, and so therefore they claim ownership of it. In this case, then they rank above opening government. The reason why I think the bit of a red herring that we drew in here was that closing government's material was closing government should rank above opening government because closing opposition engaged with opening government's material but didn't engage with closing government's material. So here that's not the case because of bilateral comparisons, right? Just because CO engaged with OG doesn't mean that OG's material like is immediately like decreased in comparison to CG's material. But that's because that's because in the principle of bilateral comparisons, you don't start inserting another party into comparison between just two parties, right? So that means that we should only be comparing opening government's material versus closing government's material at the end of the debate, like impact at the end of the debate. And therefore, the justification for giving closing government over opening government should not be that closing opposition did something that made opening government seem a lot worse. Yeah. Yeah. Broadly speaking, I think that a lot of the questions on the judge test at this point have either been explained by Jan or Seokjin, and the ones that I didn't explain tended to be like almost everybody got right. So actually, it's things that you can very easily look up in the judge guidebook. So yeah, if there are any questions about the things that I said, again, Q&A session, like Andrew said, and I'll hand it over to Hoimin, I believe, for the explanation for the OA.
Hello, everyone. So I think this is much relevant to those who already take judge tests, but I will highlight some of the contentions that we have as to some consensus that we have. And then I think that's also applied to other debate as well. All right, so for the second judge test, we did a recorded debate where we invited some of our instituent debater to debate on the motion this House would actively relocate unemployed people living in area of high and structural unemployment. And our consensus result from the CAP is this is a closing house debate. Going first is CG, CO, OO, then OG. All right, there's two things that I want to clarify is I think we have a bit of discussions in terms of opening house exchange because OG was able to brought about the urgency of why this motion needs to pass or the needs to do so. And secondly, they was able to brought of some of the benefit that could actually happen because when you relocate these people, they will have a better life and they are a motivated workforce. Therefore, they can create a more diverse workforce. On that, we have a bit of split because in OO case, there was not a lot of positive material. So on a positive material, when we compare which benefit which side have, it seems as though OO doesn't have any positive material. However, they was able to rebut on the premise and the benefit coming from OG, which made those benefits less relevant or less important to the debate. For example, OO pointing out that it's principally unjust to move these people away because the harm that OG brought, that the immediate or the urgency become less relevant when OO pointing out that those harm is not mutually exclusive, and furthermore, it can also be tackled on offsite. It doesn't have to be relocated. On top of that, that also pointed out that you removing the network of these people that they're already having. By moving them, you remove their protection, such as community or the networking that they have. Therefore, it's much more harmful on offsite compared to OG. And furthermore, they also talk about how this structural unemployment does not only apply to one area. Therefore, there's no guarantee of OG getting the benefit that they have. And I think that is a bit of government fiat problem as well. Yeah, it's okay. That's also a problem of government fiat as well, like whether it's a guarantee that these people will have a better life or these people will get a job. I think it is a fiat that you can relocate those people, but it's not a fiat to say that they will have a successful life. And therefore, OO rebuttal is crucial and is still relevant, is to say that you cannot guarantee because structural unemployment can happen in other places as well. Therefore, it's not guaranteed, as well as okay, therefore, OO in this case was also mentioning that the network and the community and the identity was also important as to part of how they improve their economic benefit, which is the class of the opening exchange. So in this sense, we can see that OO was able to target some of the urgency and all the benefit that coming from OG. And that's why even though OO may not brought like a huge positive material, they can still take over OG. Okay, and second split that we have is for opening house and closing house. Yes, so a lot of CO material also coming from the idea that already mentioned from OO. However, in CO, they was able to provide a much more analysis in terms of a structural explanations of how structural unemployment is not necessarily happen on one place, and they was able to tell expand the scope of the debate to say that how stakeholders are actually gonna behave, or how their life is going to change or affect in CO world as compared to OO. Although those line of analysis hinge upon in OO case, it was able to expand and engage with CG case better. And the same, CO was not able to provide a lot of positive material, but because their harm analysis was able to take down OG and was deeper analysis than OO, they was able to take second. But on CG side, the reason why they win is because the plausible of their benefit and the positive material that they brought and the engagement to a certain degree to mitigate opposition bench push was able to guarantee them the first place. But it was the two things that I want to clarify is first, negative material versus positive material. Just because the team doesn't have any positive material doesn't mean that they lost. You have to weigh against the analysis and the engagement that happened. And secondly, in terms of extensions. So even if CO was hinged upon the idea from the opening, but if they was able to expand the debate, if they was able to provide a clearer understanding of how individual look like or how their world look like, they were still able to take over their opening. And also another point is better engagement to opening and closing government as well. So that is it. And if you want to have further questions, you can ask other CAP or approach me on Facebook, Kakao Talk. Yeah, thank you.
All right, so then we'll open Q&As. Before we accept everybody's Q&As, we had a workshop questionnaire on our Facebook page. We like to give priority to those questions first. We will sort of do it like a fireside chat style, I guess, where the CAP will somewhat openly converse about this and share our opinions about this. If you have additional questions, you can feel free to butt in. So first question was tips for new adjudicators. Considering that we covered a lot of the principle, like the matter portion of adjudication, I like to go over a little bit of like what it feels like to actually be there, or what I felt as a new adjudicator, or what I think other new adjudicators felt. One tip is that usually new adjudicators come in as panels or trainees, simply because they're less experienced a lot of times and therefore are not as skilled as a chair. And so don't feel like you have to match your verdict towards your chair or towards your chair. Having a different verdict doesn't mean anything. If you're able to give good justification for that, that is more than enough for you for your scores. And also, when you see debaters that you know, or if you see a chair that you know, don't let reputation define the quality of their arguments or the quality of their analysis. Reputation is only as good as you can back it up. And if they're able to back it up, then that's fine, but don't give them any pluses because they just simply been in the circuit longer or you know their face. Anything that you guys want to add?
For me, I think, especially when I was beginning as an adjudicator, a big thing I had was crediting vertical extensions or extensions that kind of share the same impacts or same title, but then significantly improve on expanding the scope, expanding the impact of previously given argumentations, maybe provide a lot of justifications or mechanisms behind that. The reason this is, I think, also as Shan said, is stealing away argumentations. And it's oftentimes helpful if good teams explain how they're hijacking argumentations. But even if they don't do this job, you should still credit additional analysis. But also be careful that just because obviously in BP you have you only have 15 minutes for opening, but for closing you have 28 more minutes, 4 more speeches. So if like extensions as teams title them are simply rehashes or like just seem like as minute improvements, you don't really have to credit them just because they say, oh, we're giving an extension. So just be careful not to be tricked by words, but also make sure that you consider this is 28 more minutes. So if they're similar, you probably should give priority to opening. Yep. And lastly, score range is very important. I've seen a lot of rookie debaters give too stingy scores or too high scores. So average is 75, right? For at least this KNC. It's from 65 to 85. If teams literally stood up and spoke something for 2 minutes, that's at least a 68. You shouldn't be too stingy. So if you see a regular speech in your own session and this person spoke for 7 minutes, they had some rebuttals, they have some arguments, that's probably 75. And just be careful. Also, I think there's this psychological tendency not to go over 80, but it's okay as long as you think you're justified. But also, please be careful. 85 is not probably a debate you'll see. It's like if you have religion, this speech should change your religion. That's how good an 85 should be. So I think you should be really, really careful to try to find a range that fits you. But also, uh, even if you started giving a range of speaks which you might later regret, please try to stick as long as its range is reasonable. Try to stick with it through the entire tournament in terms of consistency and fairness. Yeah, and like just when you're losing at arguments, just try to simplify them. Don't try to think of it too complex. Try to simplify what teams are standing for. Yeah, that will be it. Anyone?
Anyone like to add or no?
I think my experience when it comes to adjudicating is probably a bit too different from a lot of other people because I started adjudicating after quite a few years of debating. So I don't know how applicable my experience might be towards many of the people who might be looking for this kind of advice. I maybe I guess the only thing I can say is from the other end of the experience curve, I suppose, is just that like we are also really looking to hear new people's inputs as well. Like just because you're there and we don't recognize you doesn't mean that we want to ignore you or want to ignore your input. And it's actually quite valuable to have like a different verdict or just different opinions, especially if the reasoning is like there and like solid. And that's just as helpful as a very experienced person's verdict as if the reasoning is similar in quality. Is I guess all I can say.
Yeah, and just one thing that popped into my mind is that sometimes a debate can get really messy, and just because it gets so messy that you don't follow it doesn't mean that you're not understanding the debate. It could actually be that the debate is that messy. So don't have self-confidence in your ability to understand the flow of the debate. And I think something dangerous is that if you feel unconfident about how the debate is flowing, you make assumptions about what has happened and you give credit where credit is not shouldn't be given. So just have self-confidence in what you've heard and stick to that. So we'll move on to the next question. The person said, I'm curious what the rankings will be in the following scenario. OG beat OO in the top half. CG enters, provides a very good extension, and successfully proves that it beats both OG and OO. CO provides two prod contributions. They refute everything that CG provides. And two, they give a substantive argument, but it's clearly inferior to what OO said. Should their rankings be CO, CG, OG, OO? And in addition to that, if the rebuttals to CG came out in the opposition whip instead of the member of opposition, will the rankings change? If so, to what extent? So anybody want to have some comments on this?
Oh, if I may. My immediate response is that depends. I really hate to say that, but it really is that depends because the thing is it depends on exactly like how the rebuttals were phrased. Like for example, were rebuttals often aren't just like as I mean I know the person who submitted this. They're a very good debater. They know better than I do. The rebuttals aren't like rebuttals often don't just consist of making sure the other team side is not true, right? Like it often consists of comparatives and often like saying like, oh, rebuttals are like it's like this, but actually because our side is like better in this way, our side is comparatively better, and so on and so forth, right? So oftentimes like rebuttals often consist of both positive and negative contribution, in my opinion, and so therefore in the first place, I think it's quite unlikely that a side can completely negate another side without having any positive contribution on their own. And so even if they have a separate like labeled substantive, I'm sure I'm almost 99% sure there's a significant amount of positive contribution within the rebuttals that this question is talking about within CEO's case that would probably take them up above like in the first place ranking and so on and so forth. And maybe that's not the case, and maybe like the way like the debate goes in a somewhat different way, although I can't really imagine a likely scenario where that can occur. But in that case, I think it really depends on what exactly they said and what exactly how the debate went, and therefore how the argumentation went. So and so therefore, it's a bit of a not enough information case, in my opinion. As for whether if the rebuttals came out in OOP whip instead of member of op, will the rankings change? Probably not. I'd say. Like again, this depends depending on how like much positive material or new material seems to go into the rebuttals as opposed to like material that was analyzing previously, like stuff that came out previously. But given that we're like the question does say that like the new there was a separate new substantive that came up in CO, and most of their stuff was based on rebutting CG or destroying CG/OG, right? Then I'd say it's quite unlikely that the stuff that comes out in the op whip is so new to debate that's not something that like government could have preempted that against at the very least, or made their argument strong enough that they could have like defended against whatever new material comes up in op whip. So I don't expect this to be a scenario where op whip's new contribution versus member of member of op's new contribution changes the ranking significantly.
I would also agree with Hewan. I think it depends simply because it, just as a side note, when we try to make these types of somewhat complex scenarios with multiple teams, we actively try to make sure that there's little, that it's clear as possible. And from the information that we've given you, that there is clearly a best answer or clearly an answer, like a single answer to the situation. I think in this scenario, however, that it would depend upon the type of engagement or rebuttals, as Hewan said, that the CO provided. And also, like as to mention, like the second point, they gave a substantive argument that's clearly inferior to what OO said. I think that then it would depend exactly what do you mean by clearly inferior. Maybe OO gave a great contribution and OG gave an even better one. And perhaps they're slightly inferior, but that by no means means that it's invalid or logically unsound. I think those types of things would factor in. And in terms of whether it comes out in whip or member, I think this would also depend upon, once again, what type of rebuttals it is. If like there were extraneous rebuttals given by member and the large crux of the material of CG is rebutted by opposition whip, then I think that evaluation would differ than if a member provided the foundations of the rebuttals against the crux of CG's extension, but then whip extended upon that. I think those are the type of scenarios where it could differ. Preferably, personally, preferably if the member addresses the main points of CG's extension and opposition whip extends upon that, I think that is ideal.
To simply add on to our previous CAP members, I think for the first question, it's important that what remains, like for example, if like CG has a little positive case versus OO basically had some relevant case that was has little remaining of a very important relevant case. I think you can say that we could compare the relevancy of these positive materials and try to see what's the most important issue of the debate. For example, if CG managed to prove some a very little bit, but however has significant this is very meaningful in the debate in this specific context, then probably their case would weigh over OO. Or for example, if OO still had a lot of argumentations that are like significantly mitigated, but still this remaining case was significant, they should probably remain over CG. So, but also the thing is, I think it's just most important that you don't discredit a lot of negative engagements that comes from other teams, considering that these are also contributions that are meaningful. So I think a bit of, but also I think it's best if teams provide why their engagements or their contribution in terms of engagements were meaningful, and probably the whip speakers will spend a lot of time explaining these cases. Lastly, on the second question, I don't think that the new materials coming from opposition whip would probably change this debate, considering that it's fully within a speaker's role to give engagements to previously stated argumentations. So therefore, it wouldn't be fair in the rules of the debate. But anyways, if we hypothetically assume that it would be unfair for us to give advantage to the teams who spoke after, then it would be an endless debate where then we would need a new speaker for government, and then we would need a new speaker for opposition. So probably chances are that the argumentations that are rebutted significantly would probably be also some things which government could have preempted and probably thought of. So it's also their blame to not have preempted that, or maybe even raise a POI to rebut against this. And given that POI was taken, could be a chance in which the government can engage upon. So also just being considering this tournament is a Euro POI, there are probably likelihoods that there will be forced engagements. You should also consider that into this debate. But I would say, as in a general scope, that it wouldn't change if you're a whip speaker or not.
If the motion is this House as Mexico would end all security cooperation with the United States aimed at limiting illegal immigration into the US, is the debate about what's in the best interest of the Mexican government or what's best for Mexico more broadly. My opinion to this is that when it states as Mexico, then it would apply for Mexico more broadly. I think when we talk about governments, usually it's about a particular administration or regime, and therefore these interests may not directly align with a long-term interest of a general people. And as a result, if it says Mexico, while the best practice is to first of all clarify with the CAP and ask questions if possible. But if not, my intuition would be that it is best for Mexico. And if it were for a Mexican government, it would state a particular regime or a particular administration.
My answer is also similar to Andrew, in the sense that you're only talking about a single stakeholder, which is the government. Obviously, teams can explain why this stakeholder is the most relevant, considering that if it were, for example, an authoritarian regime, chances are this authoritarian regime would be the most significant stakeholder. So most of the arguments would probably revolve around this actor, considering other actors wouldn't be able to influence the outcome. But we should probably still make that clear instead of assuming they would be the government, since it's simply a stakeholder. I would also say it would probably be the state, not just a part of the state apparatus.
If there is no other comments, then we'll move to general Q&A, and we're open to any and all of your questions. You can put in a chat, you can turn on your mic, you can do anything.
I got a question.
Yes.
So there is no automatic fourth, and I want to know, what do you think is the most, like, the worst thing a speaker can do?
Well, I guess that depends, and I think maybe all three of us have different answers. I guess the worst thing would for them not to speak and to be late, and though I think those are the only things worthy of a 65 if they actively harm the progress of the debate by not refusing to speak or having like crude language or like borderline harassment in the debate. So that would be a worst case scenario.
Okay, thank you. Is there like anything besides those kind of things, like in terms of, let's say, for instance, knifing or yeah, those kind of things?
I think like it depends on knifing. So it's like how big of a knife you stick in. So it's like if your knife is a critical, if you're knifing the whole entire premise of opening up government, then it wouldn't be fair for opening opposition to debate anyways, because they're completely debating upon a different premise. If you're not playing the rules of the game, you should be really, really punished a lot. So you'll probably, so by discrediting knifing, it means that you're discrediting the things that follow after knifing, which if your entire case is built upon this huge knife, which should be irrelevant to this debate, then your entire idea of your case would probably be zeroed out. But then if this knife was a small, minute rebuttal thing, you should probably discount this, but not like take off points in a sense. It's more like you're not considering things that were done as relevant, but it's not like you're gonna pick minus points out of the speech I was given. So it's rather taking things out of consideration rather than trying to actively harm their team. Other things, I probably, if you speak something and you have some logic, it's okay. There's nothing bad inherently, just that it's in relative terms, it's not complete enough. So, and like, even if you do bad, like if other teams are worse, then that's fine, right? So I think that shouldn't be a big problem.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, like chat, anything is fine. We'll open the floor for like 1 or 2 minutes, and if there's no questions after 2 minutes, we will end the Zoom. So let me just screen share so people who may have gone to the bathroom or something know that it's Q&A time. Oh, so there were some questions about when the results of the second judge test will come out. Not all of them will come out at the same time. Some of the submissions have problems in that, like a file corruption problem, or like improper name, like these types of issues have arose in the submissions. And so it depends, is what I want to say. It will come out. We want to promise that it will come out within the next 3 days, but that may differ on your time of submission, if you had problems with your submission, and issues like that. And that would be the limiting factors. So yes, I think we'll send out a couple today and ideally a couple tomorrow. And also, if by any chance you have received an email from us saying that your file has a problem, we would like some type of, we need you to resubmit something, please do so, and please do so as quickly as possible, okay? These will affect your judge scores if you don't submit them. For example, if your file is empty and we ask for a submission and you don't provide it to us by the suggested deadline, then we have no option but to give you a 0 for the OA because you haven't given us an OA. So yeah. So we'll leave it open another 60 seconds. And I also like to say for the third judge test, if you submit it earlier, you'll probably get a response back earlier as well. So just a small incentive for you to submit early. We are only people. All right, then, if there are no more questions, then we'd like to stop and the share and stop this Zoom. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this workshop. And we will be publishing the things that we've just shared with you through the screen share. We'll be publishing through our Facebook page. So in case if you want to share that to your friends or Hubes or Sunbiz, no problem. These will be up. Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Feel free to leave the room whenever you like. Thank you. Thank you.